Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. Hello and welcome back to the Prospect podcast, where we unpack the big ideas and trends in politics, arts and society. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
And it's almost that time of year again. Countries around the world are meeting for the 29th Conference of Parties, or COP, the annual meeting of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in November. This year's meeting is held in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Last year, the UK government didn't seem to take COP or its climate commitments all that seriously, and climate action more generally seems to be suffering because of what feels like a surge in populist right-wing politics around the globe. But with Labour now in power and the impact of the climate crisis being even more keenly felt, we want to dig into what to expect from this year's COP and to find out what Labour has planned for climate action.
So joining us today on the podcast and to discuss what to expect from COP are Prospect contributing editor Isabel Hilton and Sam Alvis, who is Director of Energy and Environment at Public First and author of the excellent Election Energy newsletter. Hi, Isabel. Hi, Sam.
Good morning. Hi.
Sam, Isabel, thanks so much for joining us. Isabel, you have been covering climate for a long time and you've seen very many COPs over the years. So tell us, what is COP like as a conference to attend?
Oh gosh, it can be completely bewildering. It's got a lot better, funnily enough, since social media, because at least you can find out if you're in the right, on the right list. You can find out what's going on. So there's a sort of massive negotiations hall. All of the delegations will have their own space, and people shuttle between them, trying to do side deals in side rooms. You've got the presidency trying to stop any problems getting out of hand, because that can wreck a COP. And then you have a massive space, which in some COPs has been quite far away, in others has been very close, where civil society and all sorts of other players, including lobbyists, hang out. So you have all the big ingos presenting reports, kind of dressing up as polar bears, whatever it is they're doing that year. So in one sense, it's like Climate Change University. You can learn an awful lot. In the other, it's a massive event, and you spend a lot of time trying to figure out if anything important happened here or is likely to happen. And whatever is agreed tends to be incremental, tends to be on the kind of promise side. And so, in a curious way, you're always trying to find new ways to write about it, to make it interesting. But there's nothing quite like it, in my view.
Yeah, and I think you've got now this sort of growing divide between the really technical high diplomacy stuff people are doing, which is sort of black box negotiations over finance or Article 6 and carbon trading, all these really specific subjects, which happens in a very small room somewhere hidden in the conference
Article
hall.
6 of the Paris Agreement, right? Just for listeners who
Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is about trading carbon across borders. But then there's this whole other coterie of people who are there. It's like, COP's just a good time to announce stuff. So why don't we go and we'll do our announcement, whether it's a whole host of private sector committing to buying renewable energy, whether it's financial agreements that just happens around. It's much more like a big trade show for climate in that.
So yes, that's the trade show is exactly what it's like. So it is a way to get attention to you, although you are in competition. There's a big competition for side events that you have to register for in advance. You have to be accredited in the usual way. And that's all true. Inside those small rooms, one of the problems of COPs and indeed of the whole kind of setup of the climate negotiations is that essentially they are negotiations and they function in a way like trade negotiations. So you're at a table, you have either one opponent if you're trying to do a side deal, or you're talking in a very large, across a large set of interests, and you're trying to maximize your advantage and minimize your opponent's advantage. Now, that's okay in trade. It's not really a very functional system as far as climate goes, because we are meant to be kind of working towards a common objective. But within that common objective, the arguments are all about who does what and who pays. And that's where those small rooms and those late night conversations and those COPs that go, beyond the brink and only just get through because somehow somebody's managed to hammer out a set of side deals that don't disrupt.
Yeah.
And the outcome of every COP is a sort of joint text that everybody's agreed to, right? They sign up to some sort of a statement at the end of the process.
Yes, or they agree new targets or whatever it is. I mean, the big one was obviously Paris. That was a huge agreement. It came, after the failure of the first attempt at Copenhagen, which traumatized everybody. A lot of effort was put in to getting an agreement at Paris. And there were certain changes to the approach which enabled an agreement at Paris. And one important change was that under the Kyoto Protocol, there'd been a sort of bifurcation of obligations, if you like. So the difference between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, I'm afraid it gets very quickly into this kind of language. I'm very sorry. But essentially what the Kyoto Protocol said was that developed countries...
That was in the 90s, right?
The Kyoto Protocol, well, it was negotiated in the 70s and finally agreed about 12 years later, do I remember rightly?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what it said was that developed countries have both the greater obligation and the greater capacity to act on climate change because they had got rich emitting carbon. They'd essentially occupied the carbon space. Everybody had a responsibility to act, but the emerging economies, the poorer countries, the countries that hadn't contributed to climate change, had only an obligation to do what were called nationally appropriate mitigation actions. So there was no legal obligation. Now, that was okay when it was negotiated because countries like China were relatively small emitters. But by the time you get to Copenhagen, China is the world's biggest emitter, and it's still categorized as a country that doesn't have to take on obligations. So, that's one of the big reasons that Copenhagen broke down. So in Paris, they removed that distinction. And instead of there being, as it were, a legal obligation on developed countries to act, they said to everyone, bring what you can and put it on the table. But what you put on the table should be, there should be a pathway to keeping global average temperature rises well below 2 degrees and, if possible, below 1.5, so that you wouldn't. We're not telling you what to do, but what you do, since you are a signatory to this, has to be consistent with that pathway. And so what was on the table in Paris was not consistent and wasn't expected to be. It would take us to around 3 degrees. But the idea was that as time went by, those commitments would ratchet up. And that's where we are now. We need everyone to ratchet up their commitment, or we are just going to blow through 1.5, blow through 2 degrees and get into totally unknown territory.
Yeah. So Sam, as we're sort of looking forward to this year and this huge conference, what's on the table? What are the objectives that people hope to hit, and how does that fit into that kind of ratcheting up process?
So because of this high diplomacy angle to COPs, you end up in this cycle which is almost like big COPs, small COPs. So there is some stuff like nationally determined contributions, which is how much countries are allowed to emit over to meet their climate plans. They're on 5-year cycles, so they come every now and again. That's not on the agenda this time. So what we've got is a slightly smaller COP that leaves much more in the hands of the Azerbaijani government for Baku this year to be like, what is going to be on the agenda? What are we going to be discussing? So there's a number of things that need to be sorted out. There's still sort of tweaks to various bits of the rule book. We talked a bit about carbon reporting. That's going to be on the agenda. Finance is at every COP now. It is a major issue. So a few years ago, we know that developed countries promised to reach 100 billion in climate finance. They took ages and ages and ages and ages to hit it. We might have hit it in 2022. We're still not entirely sure. So the subject of finance, particularly what that finance is for, is really going to be front and centre of the agenda this year. We'll be talking about loss and damage, how to actualise that. So that's this sense of, some people call it climate reparations. Is our developed countries going to be paying or covering insurance for the actual impacts of climate change rather than just trying to mitigate it up front?
And the other thing that has come up the agenda in recent years is adaptation. Because I think when this process started, there was certainly a feeling that if you talked about adaptation, it would weaken the already insufficient resolve actually to mitigate, to reduce emissions. So there was a reluctance to talk about it, but we're actually at a point now where adaptation is urgent. And again, poorer countries are saying to richer countries, help us because you have an obligation, to help us meet this because we can't and we're suffering from your action. So that's a kind of constant theme at COP. It's about global fairness. It's about obligation. It's about resistance to, that narrative from a lot of rich countries, or failure to step up, or kind of political pressures at home which make it difficult. So it's a complicated.
What's interesting on the adaptation point is we're overlap with biodiversity COP as well this year. So now there's these two forcing mechanisms in the calendar to be talking about the impacts of climate change and how to deal with it. And the nature point is so intertwined. It's why you see the UK government in the last couple of weeks have appointed both a climate and a nature envoy to sort of tackle these issues on the global stage, because they know it's going to keep coming up and up.
And if you think that the climate conversation is failing, I can tell you,
talking about biodiversity.
The biodiversity is truly upsetting. They've never hit their targets. We're in the middle of a mass extinction, and there is as Ben says, there's a close connection between the abuse of nature and climate. So this year, the science is telling us that enormous systems which have been carbon sinks, which have drawn carbon out of the atmosphere, like the Amazon or the ocean, those are not doing it anymore. And so that's a kind of terrible point that we've reached, in which you can expect the impact of emissions to be the greater, because they're not being mitigated by natural systems.
And at this point, this kind of crunch point, what role, like the UK used to have this reputation as a leader on the climate. We hosted COP26. We were the first country to have legislation on net zero targets, right, kind of passed in Parliament. That was under Theresa May, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Net zero put into legislation was under Theresa May, but it was an adaptation to the Climate Change Act, which Ed Miliband put in 2008 originally. So
actually it was Ed Miliband, not Theresa May.
Right. Everything comes back to Ed.
Everything. And back to Ed again with the question. So is the UK now, obviously Ed Miliband is going to COP29 as Energy Secretary. Is the UK seen as a useful partner now, as a leader, or have we kind of lost that in the past years?
So I think there's definitely some credibility to be rebuilt, and that's one of the reasons Ed is going. So Ed Miliband has been going to COPs for years and years and years. He knows the process inside out. He knows the people. He has deep personal relationships. But now he's going with the credibility and the weight of representing the government, not as just climate person. And he is there to rebuild the UK standing. And I think you've seen the government put the Clean Power mission front and centre. Power is obviously a significant portion of emissions. It's not the be-all and end-all. We can go into what else they're going to have to cover. But I think one of the things that he will be looking to rebuild is say, OK, so the people in the UK have voted for us. They've voted for our ambitious climate messaging. And it's the case of not just saying, and therefore we are doing all this stuff that adds up to our nationally determined contribution, but also developed countries, you're starting to maybe wobble. We're making the politics work, and you're showing to your Germany, to your USA, that actually climate action is good for your domestic politics. There is more than the high diplomacy here. It's about getting into the comparative politics and really selling the fact that climate and net zero is beneficially to you as a political actor as well.
I'd be really interested to know a bit more about kind of that relationship between public opinion and Labour's messaging. I mean, what evidence is there that people voted for Labour because of the climate messaging? There's obviously in the most recent election kind of a fracturing of the electorate, lots of votes for Green parties as well. Obviously, there'll be multiple different reasons for that, but clearly climate's at the core. So how solid does Labour feel its support is for its climate policies among the public?
So I think we need to distinguish slightly solid support for Labour's Clean Power 2030 mission and support for climate change and everything that's going to be required to meet that. So to take it one step back, the way the public judge environmental action is not necessarily a rating scale. Very few people are comparing different parties and saying, well, their climate policies are better than the other ones, but it is a credibility check. It's if you have to have a good one to get looked at by the public. And what we saw with the Conservative Party is they did not have a good one, and they weren't willing to give them a second look. And if you start to get down into it and you talk to the public about, OK, so here is a theoretical platform, one which is pro-environment, lots of renewables, taking action on home decarbonisation, etc., and one which is really fossil fuel heavy, extracting gas. The public intuitively now go, well, the renewable one must be Labour, even if you don't prime them, and the fossil fuel based one must be Conservative. Like there has been a bit of sorting over the past couple of years. What Labour does feel it really has a legitimacy to do is go out and build renewable energy generation at pace and scale across the country. They have seen the numbers, the support you get for onshore wind in polling now. I mean, people still keep asking us to poll it, and it's great. We're happy to poll it for them, but it's polling for old rope. You cannot get below really 70% net support for having a turbine that I can see from my window. Like, people love this stuff. Slightly more tricky with the pylon aspect. We can get into that. But really, for the stuff that Labour has promised to do, they have some serious legitimacy. And I think they are going to be going to COP and saying, we are building stuff because our people want it.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, that sort of politicisation of climate change policies has always been there. But in recent years, and in the UK, climate action does seem to have become caught up with these other sort of culture war issues. You mentioned pylons. Obviously, that makes us think of kind of the NIMBYism over green energy infrastructure. I mean, how difficult do you think a moment this is, Isabel, in the UK for parties to continue pushing forward climate action without getting caught in these really divisive arguments?
Yeah, I don't think the divisive arguments happen by accident, to be honest. I mean, there is a huge investment in discourse from the usual suspects, from the bad actors, from entities, from people, from companies with a big interest in the status quo. And these are massive, massive interests. And so these arguments come in the guise of arguments about freedom, for example, or scare stories. They're coming for your gas cooker, or they're going to take your car away. The kind of, it's posed in terms of, government as the enemy, and they will come and do something. Now, that doesn't just, come out of nowhere. That fits into the whole kind of construct of culture wars, the notion that government is bad, we need less of it, and, let the market do everything, and the individual must exercise freedom to the max. So you get an absolute, it's a recipe for the tragedy of the commons, if you like, and that's what is actively promoted. It's promoted in newspapers. It's promoted. There is a lot of work on the confusion around climate discourse. And it's quite remarkable, actually, that the public is as clear as it is in the UK. Because, first of all, it was very much like the tobacco industry. First of all, you don't actually deny it, but you say it needs further research, And then there's the attribution problem. Did my cigarettes cause your cancer? So I'm not really responsible. What else were you doing in life? And that it's, climate discussion went exactly the same route. First of all, we need more research. Exxon knew back in the 70s about climate change, but they kept on obfuscating it. They would produce scientists who would, object in small ways or confusing ways. So it is a very large and can be a confusing issue. So that even if you agree on the causes, you can then debate what to do about it. So the argument then shifts about, oh yeah, it seems to be real, but yeah, it's too expensive to do anything about it. So the cost of doing nothing was nothing. And so you're constantly having to construct arguments around complex issues that are simple enough to cut through. And the other side is really rather good at it. So it's quite hard to be funded and coherent and consistent on this. And our institutions, the institutions that shape public opinion, are also the wrong shape for the problem. So climate change, it gets parked with the environment editor. It ought to be in the economics editor's
It's everywhere.
The business, it ought to be everywhere because it's now a kind of fundamental material factor in absolutely every decision we make. You get the same in government where it's kind of, not really in Treasury or in, Ministry of Housing or whatever. So we have to reshape our institutions to put climate at the kind of baseline of all our thinking. And our media haven't done that on the whole.
Yeah, and I think that we slightly part the NIMBY argument because, so politically, is the NIMBY problem something for Labour? Well, it's between 7 and 11% of their vote share, depending on how you ask the question. And in terms of, if we look at the seats where we know we need to build lots of pylons, what's called the holistic network design, which is National Grid's plan for connecting up various bits of onshore wind to the homes that people are going to use that energy, very few of those seats are core Labour seats or likely to be again in 2029. So, I mean, their argument is we can get on and do this because we're not the ones paying the political penalty. But we sort of get stuck in this NIMBY argument because we've had 14 years of Conservative government. Like, we're used to those things really mattering to the people that are in power. The stuff that is going to be harder for this government is what you need to do next to meet carbon budgets, and that is how we move around the country, transport, what we eat and how we use our land, and how we heat and run our homes. And those are much more different arguments that we can't just sail through saying energy security lots and lots and lots, which works for the renewable side and is a fantastic, although weakening argument. We need to start thinking what those next set of narratives and conversation points are going to be with the public.
So over the weekend, we have a really good case in point on this debate, because obviously Robert Jenrick, the Tory leadership hopeful, vowed to tear up the unconservative Climate Change Act if he becomes Tory leader. I'm not sure he'll be able to do that.
Change Act.
Also, in the opposition, he won't be able to do that, surely. But you have
tear up a physical copy. That would be fine.
Yes, you could absolutely do that.
Promise delivered.
Yes.
Exactly. Very Ed Davey.
And we also, so that's obviously, the Tory leadership debate is throwing up a lot of those examples. And remember in Uxbridge, the by-election where Labour lost over supposedly ULEZ, and Keir Starmer then said, "Oh dear, we've got this all wrong. We must, we've got to talk differently about this." But so all those things that you just described, Sam, the different next steps, the different decisions, how would you frame that narrative? Like, how do you convince ordinary people, working people, Labour likes to call all of us, to make all of these changes? Like, in what way do you need to frame it?
So I think there's a couple of aspects to it. So the biggest risk we have with net zero at the moment, which the Conservatives, if they were paying any credible attention to, could seize on, is not the sense that we don't want to do net zero. It's the sense that this emerging pessimism from the public that we're not going to be able to achieve it. And it is falling in salience. So it is objectively a priority to the public, but it's not a relative priority. So there is a whole host of stuff they would like to see done. So if you could feed into this sense that we can't achieve it, and there's other stuff to achieve, and just obfuscate, that is a much bigger risk. So how do you get around that? Well, energy security was really, really salient to the public because of the war in Ukraine, the sense that gas price crises were going up. It was very real and tangible to them. So rather than just replaying that argument, we need to look for those same tangible outcomes for people. So one of the things this Labour government is really keen to do by the end of the Parliament is say, electrification is the solve for your high energy bills, right? And there's a lot of stuff we've got to do to make that real. And one of the ways that building lots of renewable power manifests is to start to make EVs more affordable, is to start to make heat pumps more affordable, and therefore a better decision for the consumer. And you have to line those up across food, across transport, across land use, and say, this is going to be the best decision for you, so therefore let's go and do it, regardless of the climate impacts. Like, Ed Miliband doesn't talk about climate that often. He talks about energy security, and finding those things that work for those other three areas, I think, is going to be vital.
I think also finding a way to actualize the efficiency argument. The cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. And we waste huge amounts of energy in this country with very inefficient, badly insulated houses. Now, there have been various attempts to address this, and they haven't really been very successful. And one of the problems is that the upfront costs of effective insulation, if you don't have much money, if your home, is not high grade in the first place, that's a kind of social problem that government ought to be able to address, but so far hasn't. And so this whole question of how the poorest in society can reap some benefit from energy policy is, I think, going to be, particularly for Labour, is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and then so there's definitely stuff around social housing, decarbonisation, of action for the poorest that government can get on and do now, and a lot of that stuff is ongoing. It's the next tier up, what the people Theresa May used to talk about, the just about managings, who aren't eligible for the things that the state are doing, but haven't got the same amount of money to pay for those upfront investments that others are. My colleague Amy at Public First has done a huge amount of work around this in a recent report called Upgrade. And actually what you need to do is, a lot of these people just need reassurance that your gas boiler that you put in last year is going to last for 10 years. We're not coming and taking that out. But what we're going to say is next time, when you do come to replace that, is making sure those decisions line up the way your heat pump is going to be affordable. Or there's going to be a little bit of money for you to do your insulation so that heat pump decision later is going to be wise. It's about just making sure that the choice, helping them make the right choice, as opposed to forcing a decision on a timescale that the newspapers are telling them they're going to have to do this year or next year. Mm-hmm. And you see the particularly the last Conservative government, Claire continues to point to this all the time, but this is what happened in Germany. So Germany rushed through a heat pump law. They were really keen, partly because of the impact of the war in Ukraine on their gas prices. And there was lots of stuff going on with the coalition government and the rise of the AfD. But the fundamental issue was people thought this was being foisted on them at an enormous speed that they weren't expecting, and that it was going to put their costs up. So what do you have to do? You have to make sure that people think it's going to lower their costs and know it's going to lower their costs. And you have to give them time to adjust and make that decision on their own terms.
And we saw the same argument, the same dynamic playing out in the case you referenced, where we're over ULEZ, where, I was hearing vox pops of people saying, well, I can't afford £35,000 for an electric car. No one is asking you to, and so once that gets out there, that becomes the argument. Or the Gilets jaunes saying, you're worried about the end of the world, I'm worried about the end of the month. So framing these arguments is critically important.
Yeah, I mean, it is critically important, and isn't it the case that you've talked about these bad actors, the usual suspects who put forward kind of narratives that are not total climate denial, but certainly hold up action? Isn't it the case that the centre-left in the UK, across Europe, are just not as good at getting out that messaging on new forms of media, partly because they're not able to they're not selling a lie, they're selling the facts. And so they can't craft, so they can't quite craft the same catchy narrative. Yeah. What do we do about that?
Well, I think it's quite difficult. I had a very, very long conversation over the weekend at a function which was very much to the right of my normal social circles. And I encountered exactly that. And plus the conviction of the man I was talking to, that people who were convinced that climate action was necessary were in the grip of an ideology, apparently, and that chimes with climate, belief in climate as though it was a religion, all these kind of strange framings that are really quite powerful. They allow you to dismiss evidence, they allow you to dismiss facts and science and complicated and difficult things if you can just, undermine the interlocutor. And that's very much around. So we have to become clearer and a mix, I think. I mean, there's been a long discussion in amongst the sort of climate media types about whether it's more effective to scare people witless or to promise them solutions. And frankly, you need both, because you can promise solutions which make them sound easy, and then when they're not easy, you get a kind of blowback. Scaring people completely witless tends to lead to paralysis, to it's too big, I can't think about it, I'm just going to party on till the end of the world kind of feeling. So it's not straightforward, and you do have to have a mixture of being very clear about the consequences of inaction, but also saying, look, this is how far we've come, and we've come a long way, and this is what the next steps are. These are the massive co-benefits that accrue to this action. You're not just avoiding catastrophe. You will have tangible benefits. You'll have cleaner air. You'll have quieter streets. You'll have lower energy bills. It's a better life.
Yeah.
But given the interests and the, enormous fossil fuel industry that is, interested arguably in a status quo, like the individuals, this is the old argument about the individual and the system. Like, really, I can do all sorts of things in my life, but that's not going to stop, massive levels of emissions, because the fossil fuel industry is continuing to, do oil and gas exploration. So there's a kind of, the messaging to the ordinary person, or the people like us, it needs to be strong in order for governments to have the kind of the mandate to do the stuff on behalf of everybody else, right? Rather than convincing everybody to make little choices that will make things better.
But there are, individual action. People say, well, what can I do once you've laid out some stark facts? And there are a whole bunch of things that people can do. And the first one that I respond to that question with is write to your MP, and in fact your local council, anyone who has political power, make them know that you really care. The second thing about trying to take individual climate action is if you understand your own carbon footprint and you can see where you can affect it, it's an education. You understand that this is, quite a complicated thing, and that you can't do it as an individual. So you need to mobilize everybody. You need to mobilize all your friends and family, and without being too boring about it, but particularly your politicians. And I think that's one of the good outputs of people taking personal responsibility. But to say it's all up to individuals is ridiculous.
Yeah, and there's things you can do as an individual that have outsized impact, right? So we know that if you get solar panels on your road, and you speak to your friends and neighbours about how great your solar panels are, and they look at your solar panels, then everyone else starts to get solar panels. It's honestly the biggest driver. You see this across the US, you see this across Australia, that the biggest driver of solar panels is social contagion. So there's stuff that you can do that has either market leverage or individual leverage that definitely works. But when it comes to what are we trying to convince the public of or to do? So the UK isn't other countries. There is this ingrained sense that climate action is important. So I was in Thanet the other week talking to people about renewable energy. And the one thing that they say over and over again is, God, it's ugly, but it's important, isn't it? Or they will mention the kids, or they will mention the grandkids. What they then need to do as media actors or spokespeople is say, okay, so we have to increase the salience of this. We've got to make sure it's top of the agenda, not keep reminding them that it's an important thing to do. And how do you do that? So there's organisations like Round Our Way who are talking about to working class people about the impacts of climate change in our lives, whether it's from flooding or whether it's from disrupted businesses, the stuff that is really manifesting itself now. You start to raise that threat level. What political actors have to do, and you see Joe Biden do this, you see Macron doing this, it's really selling the benefits. And at the moment, that's very much on the economy side. But as Isabel said, very quickly, that is going to get to the individual side. This is achievable. It is going to be beneficial for you because your bills will be lower or you will have a new job opportunity. Whatever that thing needs to be, and I caution that thing needs to be specific to the action that you're looking for. We have a tendency at the moment to say, climate action, all of it's good because it's good for the economy. It's not all. We've got to be quite clear. The thing that you're trying to sell needs to have a real, achievable, tangible benefit. And if there's no one that gets that more than Morgan McSweeney in Number 10 at the moment, that is his whole political project to say this person's life must be better because we're in power now. And you just have to make sure that climate fits into that frame.
And for both of you, it'd be really interesting to hear. Obviously, Sam, you're a bit closer maybe to this government because you did some work with Ed Miliband and his team on Great British Energy. But what would you guys give them out of 10? So far on climate policy, how are they doing?
Compared to whom?
Let's not compare them to the previous government on their own terms. From what you, I guess, just from a base of 0, how are they doing? I think.
I'm going to go 7. I'm a political hack, and I'm very supportive of the direction the government's taking. But if you read through the manifesto, those sad acts of us that have. The stuff that you need to achieve climate is in there over and over and over again. They have got into government. They have found a number of things to be very difficult, as some people have noticed, and maybe struggled to get some stuff across the line. What have they got across the line? Signing new solar panels off, making sure they're building, getting GB Energy up and running, making sure the National Wealth Fund is going to go to green supply chains, etc. Every time they fall back on something, they fall back on a climate policy. And that is mostly, I would say, Ed Miliband's doing. But it is so ingrained in not only achieving it for climate's sake, but to everything else that they want to achieve. The reason I'm not gone 10 is because the next stuff they have to do to meet their carbon budgets is not currently in the manifesto, and it's going to require deep, deep thinking, work with the Committee for Climate Change on how you go about doing that, those individual actions we've talked about. Those things are really hard, and they've been kicked down the road by government after government after government. So that will be the real test for them.
What do you say, Isabel?
No, I would go with 7.
7 is fair.
That's pretty good.
I think they've made a really good start.
Okay.
And I think, as we all understand, this is difficult stuff. But you need a huge amount of political will and focus. And Ed Miliband has that. He's, as Sam says, he's done it for years. And he is tenacious. He's, I think, a good operator. And he's absolutely clear about his priorities. I don't think there's another job in government he'd want, frankly. Yeah. I think this is his mission. And you need someone like that. Because if it's just nice to have, or yes, it's a nod on the manifesto, it doesn't happen. This is a classic case of the important constantly being derailed by the urgent. So you really do need a minister who sees this as both.
An advocate's role now, to make a horrible pun, but we've got all our eggs in one basket, and we need
Sam.
to. Sorry, I just had to.
I don't think we can. We can't keep going without noting how terrible that pun was.
We'll cut that right out. But this stuff is really only sat in DESNES at the moment, and that's because the power mission has been front and centre, as I said. But what we need to be talking to is the Lou Haigs of this world, the Steve Reeds. All of the different departments need to take climate with the same tenacity that Ed does to ensure that's how you hit carbon budgets. You don't hit it because you decarbonise your power sector. You've hit it because you've decarbonised everything the government does.
And that has to apply across, all sectors of the economy too. We have the tragedy of the Commons, but Mark Carney, before the Paris COP, went to Lloyd's of London, the big, centre of global insurance, and talked about the tragedy of the horizons, the fact that money thinks short term and is rewarded short term, and climate, is beyond those horizons. So, across every institution, we have to build climate into thinking in ways that we haven't had to before. Our institutions are the wrong shape. Our governments are the wrong shape. And that has to be, in order for us to get to where we need to get to remotely in time, we're going to have to do that.
And it's one of the beauties of the Climate Change Act is that the carbon budgets, yes, we've got a net zero target for 2050, but the carbon budgets are cyclical and they're much shorter than that. So that is a legal forcing mechanism on the government to do climate change. If you haven't got a clear plan, as the last government found out to their cost, then you will get sued. And I don't it's a big political risk that Ed Miliband has to go up and defend his lack of climate plans in the dock because his friends of the earth have said this is not good enough.
Yeah.
That was a far-sighted measure, I
Yeah,
have to
exactly.
say, because you can pass a Climate Change Act and then go home and feel very good about yourself and not do anything because the targets are all at 2050. So that was a really inspired bit of political manoeuvring.
Yeah. All right. Well, Sam and Isabel, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts about COP, thoughts about what Labour is doing okay at, pretty much, and could do more of. And yeah, thanks so much for joining the Prospect podcast this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.